2, 1.
Good afternoon, my name is Sebastian Munoz.
And I'm David Joseph.
And today we're exploring the topic of the effectiveness of rehabilitation in prisons. And for our topic, we're asking the question, are American prison systems doing enough to rehabilitate the incarcerated? And we found in our thesis was that through the evaluation of the socio-cultural influences, economic incentives, and political agendas, we found that in American prison systems, rehabilitation is overshadowed by much more powerful factors such as profit and political biases, and that these systems are not introducing enough policies and providing enough funding to secure the successful rehabilitation of their prisoners.
To prove the significance of our topic, I have a graph here that shows the rise in incarceration rates in the United States in the last century. In the 1880s, the incarceration rates per 100,000 people was about less than 100, or a little less than 100. And then moving on to 2010, it's more than 500 for every 100,000. For my lens, I focus on the interests of private prison industries, which is to gain profit through government contracting, and then also through penal and ex-convict labor, which is penal labor being the labor that prisoners are forced to do, and ex-convict labor being the labor or the work that is offered to prisoners who are re-released into society. And what I've found is that penal labor, there's a huge discrepancy between the amount their wages and our wages, being that they earn less than $1 per hour, which is drastically different from the minimum wage to free people in society, and that ex-convicts experience lower wages on average and less work. And then I also talked about the host communities, where prison systems claim to offer benefits to these communities, and that these benefits are not so much shown, and that the morale in those communities degrade because of the thought that they're incarcerating their own individuals, and that's how they're gaining economic influence.
All right, my blend was sociocultural effects, and this is a graph of inmate education and programs in prisons, with vocational education, which is job training, being the most effective. And that's the main program I'm going to be focusing on today. The three effects I found were effects on prisoner morale and education, and I found that programs seem to raise the self-esteem of prisoners. And in a study by Parker, he found that these programs did raise the self-esteem of prisoners, and it was a direct positive correlation with self-esteem and recidivism rates, which is the rate at which prisoners would be released and reoffend. And then that leads to the prison environment in which the self-esteem and the collaboration skills these prisoners learned while partaking in the programs affect the prison itself, in which they work well with inmates and guards more than they did before taking the programs. And so in a connection to David's lens, the prison becomes more peaceful, which lowers the cost of medical treatment because there's not as much violence in the prison. And then that leads to effects in society, such as re-entry to society and lawful work, which is due to the job training and the academic training, they're more likely to either pursue further education, or they're more likely to find legitimate work, such as construction or other jobs of the sort. And then re-entry to society, with the skills they learn and the self-esteem they gain, they're more likely to restore connections between family and friends, and they're more likely to have successful re-entry into society. And then this graph right here is where Americans prefer resources allocated, with skill and employment training and treatment being towards the low, showing that the ineffectiveness of rehabilitation in our society. And then this chart showing, in another connection to David's lens, that in private prisons where rehabilitation is less likely to be attempted, that assaults on guards and fellow inmates are more frequent.
For the political lens, I focused on the current state of the justice system and prison systems in the United States. And what I saw is that in remains mostly stagnant with very little policy reform, and that's because of the polarity among parties, where the main two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, argue what should happen with as far as policy reform, and that that's it. And here in the next slide, I have the Democrats and Republicans, and to contrast what their views are as far as policy reform. So the Democrats are committed to reducing incarceration rates through more lenient sentences and through lenient and shorter sentences, and that they also seek to eliminate discrimination in the U.S. justice system, whereas Republicans are focused on the deterrence of crime rather than the rehabilitation. So they seek to deter especially children and repeat offenders from doing more crime. And they also seek to reduce funding to rehabilitation programs because they see that it doesn't work. For the solution to the economic lens, I saw that incentivization and public involvement would work best to increase the effectiveness of prison systems here in the US, where if we were to provide us an incentive for prisons to rehabilitate rather than for profit, then obviously rehabilitation would become more prominent, and public involvement would also allow for prisons to better reflect the public opinions for how they should be run. The limitation to this solution would be that there would be less funding for prison systems because the contracting would go down because funding would have to go into rehabilitation, and there would also be less funding from penal labor. So.
My solution for the socio-cultural lens was that criminal justice experts and not politicians should make criminal policy, because politicians are more likely to be biased towards the general population's feelings and fears towards criminals. So they tend to be more punitive, and they don't reflect the current trends happening in prison. Whereas criminal justice experts, they are the ones making the data, they're the ones reviewing the data. So they're more likely to be, their policy would be more likely to reflect what works and what doesn't work with prison rehabilitation. The only limitations to that is that no matter how effective that policy is, there's still going to be overcrowding in prisons and a lack of motivation to partake in those programs.
The solution that we found for the problems that we found in the political lens would be to ease tension between political parties and to find a middle ground. And this would allow for policy reform, which would allow us to increase incarceration rates and improve rehabilitation. But obviously the limitation to this would be that it is unlikely for the parties' opinions to just dissolve and for us to find a middle ground.
And our conclusion is that American prison systems are not doing enough to rehabilitate their prisoners in their current state. However, this can be improved upon if they allow for more public involvement, incentivize rehabilitation rather than incarceration, introduce more effective and enticing rehabilitation programs, and policy reformation.
And then these are the works we used.
Thank you, guys. David, in the future, what change would you make to your group norms, and how would you expect that to improve the team presentation?
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, yeah. What changes would you make to your group norms, and how would you expect that to improve the team presentation?
Group norms being like the occupations kind of, or?
No, group norms meaning, how you worked with each other as a group, and the kind of the deadlines and, expectations you were supposed to fulfill.
So I think that as a group, it was difficult as far as group norms went because of a team member leaving, and the group norms kind of, for him, had to be split up between the two of us and the jobs that he was given. So I think if we were to do this presentation over again, that I would make the group norms more flexible and allow it for it to be more kind of like spread out so more could be applied, because it was difficult to fit so much of that work into just the two of us.
Okay, your argument, the solution and conclusion your team identified, and why?
The strongest counter-argument was that many reports by the U.S. government found that rehabilitation was the main use for prisons, and that every other factor was secondary or necessary to the prison system.
Okay, thank you.